My research shows that Mathew Franklin Whittier, myself in the 19th century, was the real author of quite a bit of material which scholars attribute to Margaret Fuller. So we're talking everything signed with a letter F in the Dial, the Transcendentalist Journal, and everything signed with a star from the fall of 1844 until about mid to fall 1846 in the New York Tribune before Margaret Fuller went to Europe as the paper's foreign correspondent. Now, as far as the star signature, I've said that Mathew used this as early as 1829, continued to use it all the way through his career off and on. The last one I found was 1873. He may have even used it past then for all I know. And this is in a bunch of different newspapers, including especially the Portland Transcript, but also several others, including the Boston Chronotype and the Boston Weekly Museum and the Odd Fellow. So this was Mathew's signature, and he had a particular reason for using it. What apparently happened is that this developed as a rumor, and it's the kind of thing where Margaret Fuller just never stood up and said, no, this isn't me. She just let people think it was, and then gradually she adopted it herself. And by the time she went over to Europe, she continued using the signature as though it was hers. But since it was really Mathew Franklin Whittier's signature, he kept right on using it also. He wasn't going to stop using his own secret signature just because Margaret Fuller had appropriated it. So I have shown that there's a number of little smoking guns which show that it really can't possibly be Fuller. And we're not going to go into those here because what I want to show is that it's the same voice that Mathew had been using all along from 1829 until 1873. And this is a matter more of plausibility than it is of smoking gun type in-your-face proof. So if you're a cynic and you want to try to shoot down what I'm saying, you're going to be wasting your time watching this because I'm already saying that this isn't enough by itself. It's very difficult to look at style and two people and say that this is absolute proof, that was the right person. But what we want to show is that it's entirely plausible based on style that this voice you see in the Tribune signing with a star is the same voice that has appeared all the way from 1829 through 1873. Now, as far as establishing that Mathew was in fact using that signature, I've done that elsewhere. That would take us way too far afield. I've already established that well beyond a reasonable doubt that it was in fact Mathew who adopted that signature in 1829. So I'm going to get off the screen entirely here, and we're going to be on the computer for the rest of this video, and we're just going to look into my digitized database. Here we have a database that I've pulled together specifically for this purpose, and I have it broken down by category, by theme. And you can see what they are here: capital punishment, compassion, essay style, and so on. So let's go to review style as a place to start and see what Mathew's voice sounded like signing as the star in previous and subsequent papers, and also using other pseudonyms. So I've vetted all of these. All of these are definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier in my opinion, and I can back that up. So let's see. Let's start with the earliest that we have in this category. And we have something about Goethe in the Boston Galaxy in 1829. This is February 6th, 1829. So Mathew is 16 years old at this point. Let's see what Mathew Franklin Whittier sounded like at 16 years old talking about Goethe. He's reviewing or speaking of Wilhelm Meister. I believe I pronounced that right. And he says, "The name of Goethe and the frequent allusions to this work in foreign literature will doubtless secure to it a certain degree of interest. We do not believe, however, that it can be popular here, and those who now bring to their first acquaintance with it a knowledge of its high reputation at home will be apt to think that reputation excessive and unsubstantial. The first opinion which most readers will form of it will be, we think, that it is often gross and licentious and sometimes vulgar. Wilhelm, a young man, the son of a merchant in a German city, is represented as connected with dissolute actors and actresses and with various persons of no elevated rank or character, their manners and habits never refined and sometimes coarse or worse, their revels and excesses, his intrigue with one and the intrigues of others with him, are told faithfully. No love of license deepens the coloring of the picture, and no depraved imagination obtrudes its abominations, but things in themselves licentious and depraved are portrayed with rigorous simplicity and unreserve. It will also be thought that the story is not skillfully constructed. It often waits a great while for people to get through their talk, and though there is a certain art shown in bringing out circumstances and adventures to sustain thoughts and sentiments, and as one gets on, the various incidents draw together and the whole assumes unexpectedly unity and completeness, still it is obvious that the story is regarded by the author only as holding together the reflections, and there are novel readers with whom this would be a sore defect. Then he says, nevertheless, there is that in the book which will give it great power with some readers, making them read it with almost anxious interest and wish there were much more of it. The profound and thought-stirring reflections upon art, society, religion, and human nature, as seen under 1,000 singular aspects, the far-reaching and scrutinizing insight into the principles of action and the true nature, origin, and relation of various emotions, the beautiful fancies by which these strange thoughts are illustrated, and the power and eloquence with which truths are often enforced, will give to it, with a certain class of readers, a permanent and decided value, and though they may not make many persons buy the book, they will make some at least keep it within their reach. The criticisms upon the drama, and upon Hamlet particularly, are often quoted as among the best that were ever made, and it goes on. That's Matthew at 16 years old, and you'll notice it's a very thoughtful review, and the voice is plausibly that of the star writer in the Tribune. This is going to take quite a while because, we're building a case here. Most of my work is like that. We're building a case, and it takes time to build a case, Now let's go to the Oddfellow. This was signed with an asterisk, and it was signed in September 23, 1846 is when it was printed, rather. And he's talking about the theaters in general in Boston. Now Matthew's work for the Tribune ended in probably July or possibly as late as August, if some of his pieces were held over on file, of that same year. So we're talking a couple months after he finished writing with this same signature in the New York Tribune. This is about the time that Margaret Fuller went overseas and Matthew, probably not coincidentally, quit the paper. He went down to New Orleans and worked for a while for the Daily Delta down in New Orleans, but that's another story. Here he's writing for the Oddfellow. The theaters. The performances of Mr. Wallach at the Boston Theater have attracted full houses during the last week. On Monday evening, in the characters of Benedict and Dick Dashel, he was well received, and the audience expressed their oft-repeated approbation of his performances. On Wednesday evening, Mr. Wallach appeared in the character of Don Cesar de Bassan. This part was first performed in London by Mr. Wallach on its translation and adoption from the French, and made such a sensation that it was enacted 126 times. We agree with a contemporary that it is one of the most remarkable, original, and pleasing three-act dramas we have ever seen. If we thought it would not spoil the interest of the spectator, we would describe the plot, but we will merely say that it is founded on the adventures of a wild, gaming, and jovial Spanish cavalier whose squandered estate subjects him to poverty and danger, and the wiles of a powerful enemy, at whom and at every difficulty he laughs, and over all remains triumphant at last. The audience were in raptures with Wallach's inimitable acting of an inimitable character. It is singularly well adapted to his powers, and it was the general remark of all when they dispersed that they had never seen a performance go off in better style. And it goes on a little bit like that. All of these you could read for yourself. You can read more by just stopping the screen, so I don't really have to read the entire piece. Again, for those of you who want to compare in more detail, you can just keep reading on the screen. So this is the Star, and this is just a couple months after Mathew stopped writing for the Tribune as the same signature. And all I'm establishing here is that this is plausibly the same voice. So let's see. We're going to look at a review in the Portland Transcript with this same signature of Alexander Smith, written for the Transcript. The book was published by Ticknor, Reed, and Fields, Boston. And he says, "Now that the first clamor of trumpets is over, and a man of slender voice may be heard, we propose to offer a few thoughts on the works of the new poet. We designate our author after the manner of the newspapers, not feeling quite sure all the while that the adjective belongs to him any longer. The reviewers of one sort and another have sounded his praise until his name is generally familiar and strikes us as something no longer new. Besides, a short time, an incredibly short time, suffices for some authors, or at least their books, to grow old, while others, we are constantly reminded, never grow old. The great thoughts, the true and pure thoughts, combined with the clear, simple, and chaste expression, can never grow old. The Iliad and the Odyssey are as young as when they used to be cited by the rhapsodists." There's another blasted typo. It seems like you get them all, and there's always one more. I'll read that sentence again. "The Iliad and the Odyssey are as young as when they used to be recited by the rhapsodists. The epics of Milton and the plays of Shakespeare are still fresh in their immortal youth." That's the way they used to spell Shakespeare. That's not a typo. "But a book made up of forced, strained, and unnatural thoughts, written out in an overdecked and meretricious style, can never be long new. If it struggle into life at all, instead of youth it will enter at once upon its dotage. If it attract attention, it will hold no longer than the deformity of the cripple retains the gaze of the passer-by. Such a book cannot possibly live long. No friendly nursing can resuscitate it. No kind puffing, meaning advertising, can keep it in the breath of life. It will die at nightfall with the ephemeris, and none the less surely than he." And he goes on. I'll scroll up a little bit, so if you want to read more of this, you can stop the screen and read more. The point being that notice that there's self-deprecation here as being a slender voice. There's irony in here and sarcasm. Now, you get a little stronger sense here that this is the same voice as was writing in the Tribune. Same signature. I'll bring it down here. You can see that there is, in fact, a star and some of my notes about it. Now, what I might do is to link some of these things underneath this video blog entry. So if you want to read more of these, you can download them directly yourselves. I'm not showing, or at this point, I haven't decided to show any of the originals. It's too much, it's an awful lot of work for me to photograph those things and put them in place, and there's just too much in this particular entry. I'll just read a little of this. This is signed Caleb Leathers. That's Mathew Franklin Whittier's signature for a period of time around 1855 in the Portland Transcript. And he says, Thackeray is the baldest novelist in the world. Now pay attention to the mind and the sense of humor and the sensibilities behind the writing. Try to tune into the person that's talking to you. Thackeray is the baldest novelist in the world. He don't idealize nor sentimentalize one particle, but shows up his characters just as they are. The judgment seat before which he calls them knows no favoritism, but awards equal and exact justice. They cannot, with any amount of finesse, elude the light that beams from the tribunal he erects. The inner and outer man of his personages are completely correspondent. Soul and spirit appear in the most undisguised shape in their manners, faces, dress, and conversation. If they are hypocrites, the unmistakable odor of hypocrisy surrounds them. If canting, driveling fools, they shine in their true light. If knaves, their knavery, be they male or female, is so inscribed upon them that there is no possibility of their being misjudged, and so on. Now, note that this person has a sense of humor, and that he or she, in this case he because it's Caleb Leathers, is a philosopher. So it was the same philosopher with a wry sense of humor who was writing as the star for the New York Tribune. It was not Margaret Fuller, what I would call a pseudo-philosopher. Now there's another pseudonym that Mathew, a signature that Mathew adopted late, around 1870. And we have a couple of examples. He signs MDW instead of MFW. It's a pretty transparent signature. He had used D, he'd signed with D in the New York Constellation back 1830, 31, and 32. So he's just, I think, just taken his old signature D and replaced his middle initial with it, and now he's signing MDW. I vetted this. I've gone through it very carefully and established that this is, in fact, Mathew Franklin Whittier. So John Rogers is a sculptor. One of his, he would make these little like figurine type group sculptures, and then he would mass produce them. One of them, which includes John Greenleaf Whittier, is to be found at the museum, the Whittier Museum in Amesbury. Now, whether the sculptor gifted it to him or Mathew gave it to, his brother, we don't know how it got there. I don't know how it got there. But anyway, here we are by MDW. When we read the productions of gifted pens, we always feel a desire to know something respecting the authors, their life history, so much of it, at least, as is proper for a curious public to know. I've revealed way more about Mathew, unfortunately. And we enjoy their works much more after reading a biographical sketch. It is the same in regard to artists. We could not be content till we had searched books and found out all we could about Raphael, Angelo, Leonardo da Vinci, the charming landscape painter, Blake, the spiritual visionary, poet and artist, Benvenuto Cellini, whose autobiography is more entertaining than any novel, and whose delicately wrought works were placed among the most precious treasures of princely splendor. And he goes on, there's a mention of the piece that includes John Greenleaf Whittier. Let me see if I can find that. Again, you can read all of this yourself. Tell you what, I'll just search for it. That'll be easy. Here we are. He includes him in a group. The figure of Lincoln is said to surpass in form and feature every other effort that has been made to embody the expression of that great man. The fugitive story, representing Garrison, Beecher, and Whittier listening to the story of a fugitive slave woman. A little cousin of the poet cried out on seeing this group, "That's Uncle Greenie," because he's part of the family. See, this is part of the Whittier family. This is John Greenleaf Whittier's brother. And that's how he knows that a little cousin of the poet cried out on seeing this group, "That's Uncle Greenie." So this is a little anecdote, the type of which the Whittier historians would, kill for, basically, told by Mathew, and they have no idea. They don't know that this was Mathew's brother writing it. There's something wrong with this sentence above. I'm going to check it and see if I can find whether that's a mistake up here. So we're looking at, I'll just give you an idea what my collection is like. We'll go ahead and stay online here. Who knows how long this is going to go? Who cares? 1374. Okay. So let's see if I can find that in my photographic collection. So I've got a master file for all this stuff. I've got MFW Works Photographic. We go to the newspaper, which is the Portland Transcript. And what did I say this was? The January 3rd, 74. So let's go down here. I have to look at it here. I have to look at it by pseudonym. MDW, that's MFW, 1374. So here it is. And let's see if I was right that there's something wrong with this sentence or not. We're looking for the paragraph that starts in 1856, right above coming to the parson. So there's 1856. There's coming to the parson. That's Uncle Greenie. The fugitive story, representing Garrison, Beecher, and Whittier listening to the story of the fugitive slave woman. Nope, that's exactly the way it was written. There's something wrong here. I would guess that the typographer missed something because I think it's a fragment sentence. So I don't know what's happening there, but I did read it correctly. But that's how my collection works, in case you're interested. I don't have everything photographed. So let's move on to a review of Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is also signed MDW, August 14, 1869. This is called Old Town Folks. I guess that's a story by Harriet Beecher Stowe that came out somewhat later on. So he says, the story of New England life half a century or more ago is written in Mrs. Stowe's happiest mood. She shows us, quote, New England in its seedbed before the hot suns of modern progress had developed its sprouting germs into the great trees of today. She further tells us in her preface that her, quote, studies for this object have been pre-Raphaelite, taken from real characters, real scenes, and real incidents, and some of those things in the story which may appear most romantic and like fiction are simple renderings and applications of fact. Now, when Matthew would praise anyone, he would project himself into that praise, or you would say he picks up on those things that he most admires, including the things that he admires about himself. So this is a characteristic of Matthew's own writing. He draws very heavily from real life, real characters, real scenes, and real incidents. So that's why he mentions it here, I would say. And then he says, for vividness of delineation and naturalness of character, we doubt if Mrs. Stowe has her superior. Her pen pictures are drawn from the life with the hand of a master artist. If divested of modern drapery, the counterparts of her portraits would be on every hand. The spinster asphyxia is not a myth, and every village has its, quote, do-nothing, who, like Sam Lawson, is useful in his way. It takes all sorts of people to make a world, is a common saying, and, quote, variety is the spice of life. Really, we do believe that this entertaining book would lose a very essential part of its interest if Sam were left out. Then he goes on to introduce the character and draw from the book some. So again, it's the same voice. This is the same person who was talking to you, speaking to you in the New York Tribune. And you can compare these with Margaret Fuller's other works. And I think you'll find, I haven't done it, but I think you'll find that those works, like Summer on the Lakes, that are definitely Margaret Fuller's, will not compare as favorably to the work in the Tribune signed with a star as these do. Now we go to the Tribune. These are things that were written for the Tribune. And let's start at the beginning. This is early on in this series, December 7, 1844. This is about Emerson and the state of literature in the United States. So we're now in the Tribune. This is some of the disputed work that scholars believe was written by Margaret Fuller. At the distance of 3 years, this volume follows the first series of essays, which have already made to themselves a circle of readers, attentive, thoughtful, more and more intelligent, and this circle is a large one if we consider the circumstances of this country and of England also at this time. In England, it would seem there are a larger number of persons waiting for an invitation to calm thought and sincere intercourse than among ourselves. Copies of Mr. Emerson's first published little volume called Nature have there been sold by thousands in a short time, while one edition has needed 7 years to get circulated here. Several of his orations and essays from the Dial have also been republished there and met with a reverent and earnest response. So you see, at this time, Emerson was appreciated in Europe, but not so much in America. We suppose that while in England the want of such a voice is as great as here, a larger number are at leisure to recognize that want. A far larger number have set foot in the speculative region and have ears refined to appreciate these melodious accents. So again, you can find this online, but I'll scroll down a little bit. If you want to read more of this, you can read it on the screen. This is the same voice, a philosopher, okay? Matthew is a philosopher. He's been a philosopher since he was a little boy, 12, started publishing at 12, okay? And I can show you material that Matthew published at age 13, which is as sophisticated philosophically as any of this stuff. Okay, so here we have Festus, a poem by Philip James Bailey. Now, Matthew, signing with the letter F, had written about Festus for the Dial, and there's a reference somewhere in here, it's kind of hard to find, to that effect. And when scholars present this one, Judith Matson Bean and Joel Meyerson in Margaret Fuller Critic, they mention that Margaret Fuller, as they believe, had written about this in the Dial, but that wasn't her. Okay, let's see, do I have that? Oh, here we go. The book is a precious, even a sacred book, and we could say more of it had we not years ago vented our enthusiasm when it was in first full flow. The extract which we then gave sold at once all the English copies then to be obtained. Okay, that's Matthew speaking. That's not Margaret Fuller. That's how we know. This is the smoking gun that means that either Margaret Fuller wrote all of this and all of the material in the Dial signed F, or Mathew Franklin Whittier wrote all of this and all of the material signed F in the Dial. It can only be one or the other because of this particular little couple sentences. Anyway, let's get into it just a little bit. We are right glad to see this beloved stranger domesticated among us, yet there are queer little circumstances that herald the introduction. The poet is a barrister at law. Well, it is always worthy of note when a man is not hindered by study of human law from knowledge of divine, which last is all that concerns the poet. Now, this is also Matthew projecting himself into the review, because Matthew could have been an excellent lawyer and he could have made a very nice, tidy income. But looking into it, he found that human law has nothing to do with the truth, and he's only concerned with finding divine truth. Matthew was a mystic and a philosopher, and he would not bend his search for the truth, which he considered sacred, to practice law, which would involve lying. See, so that's why he's saying what he's saying here. He says, then the preface to the American edition closes with this discreet remark. It is perfectly safe to pronounce it, the poem, one of the most powerful and splendid productions of the age. Dear New England, how purely was that worthy thee, region where the tyranny of public opinion is carried to a perfection of minute scrutiny beyond what it ever was before in any age or place, though the ostracism be administered with the mildness and refinement fit for this age. Dear New England, yes, it is safe to say that the poem is good. Whatever Mrs. Grundy may think, that's a reference I won't go into, she will not have it burned by the hangman if it is not. But it may not be discreet, because she can, if she sees fit, exile its presence from bookstores, libraries, center tables, and all mention of its existence from lips polite, and of thine also, who hast dared to praise it, on peril of turning all surrounding eyes to lead by its utterance. This kind of gentle excommunication thou mayst not be prepared to endure, O preface writer, and we should greatly fear that thou wert deceived in thy fond security, saying that it was safe to pronounce it. For Festus is a bold book. And again, it goes on, this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's voice, and it's a fairly unique voice. You know, this is the philosopher and humorist who hides behind the scenes and who has been persecuted. Okay, he's an abolitionist. He's a Garrisonian. and he dares not come out for persecution. So he's projecting his own life into this when the preface writer says that it's perfectly safe to pronounce it one of the most powerful and splendid productions of the age. Well, Matthew knows from personal experience it is not safe to come out and dare to suggest that one's own work is powerful, which it was. It's so powerful that it made Margaret Fuller famous, okay, when people thought it was her. Well, I think there's Shelley too. I think we've got a pretty good sense of that. This is going to be very long, and I don't apologize for it at all because, as I said, I'm building a case, and you can watch as much or as little of this as you want to. Let's see here. We're going to go into a different type of evidence now. We've got a couple of things here that are absolutely in Mathew Franklin Whittier's style, but don't make any sense for Margaret Fuller. They're not, so far as I know, not being a Fuller scholar. This is not her style. So we've got a couple of things here that are Matthew's in the Tribune, which are not Fuller's style. So one of them is signed with an asterisk and one is not. So let's look at that first before we go back and look at something parallel that Matthew wrote. This is signed with a star in the Tribune. It's taken to be Margaret Fuller. There's our star at the end. They used a big-sized, oversized star in the Tribune for him. What fits a man to be a voter? Is it to be white within or white without? Now, this is a parable. It's a parable about whether black people should be allowed to vote. And of course, he's an abolitionist and aligned with William Lloyd Garrison, or soon will be if he isn't at this point. The country had been denuded of its forests, and men cried, "Come, we must plant anew, or there will be no shade for the homes of our children, or fuel for their hearths. Let us find the best kernels for a new growth." And a basket of butternuts was offered. You notice this sounds kind of vaguely biblical almost. But the planters rejected it with disgust. "What a black, rough coat it has," said they. "It is entirely unfit for the dishes on a nobleman's table, nor have we ever seen it in such places. It must have a greasy, offensive kernel, nor can fine trees grow up from such a nut." "Friends," said one of the planters, "this decision may be rash. The chestnut has not a handsome outside. It is long encased in troublesome burrs, and when disengaged it is almost as black as these nuts you despise. Yet from it grow trees of lofty stature, graceful form, and long life. Its kernel is white, and has furnished food to the most poetic and splendid nations of the older world." "Don't tell me," says another, "brown is entirely different from black. I like brown very well. There is Oriental precedent for its respectability. Perhaps we will use some of your chestnuts if we can get fine samples. But for the present, I think we should use only English walnuts, such as our forefathers delighted to honor. Here are many baskets full of them, quite enough for the present. We will plant them with a sprinkling between of the chestnut and acorn." "But," rejoined the other, "many butternuts are beneath the sod, and you cannot help a mixture of them being in your wood at any rate." "Well, we will grub them up and cut them down wherever we find them. We can use the young shrubs for kindlings." And it goes on like that. At that moment entered the council 2 persons of a darker complexion than most of those present, as if born beneath the glow of a more scorching sun. First came a woman, beautiful in the mild, pure grandeur of her look, in whose large eye a prophetic intelligence was mingled with infinite sweetness. She looked at the assembly with an air of surprise, as if its aspect was strange to her. She threw quite back her veil, and stepping aside made room for her companion. His form was youthful, about the age of one we have seen in many a picture, produced by the thought of 18 centuries, as of one, quote, instructing the doctors. I need not describe the features. All minds have their own impressions of such an image. Severe in youthful beauty. In his hand he bore a little white banner on which was embroidered, "Peace and goodwill to men." Speaking of Jesus here. In his hand he bore a little white banner on which was embroidered, "Peace and goodwill to men," and the words seemed to glitter and give out sparks as he paused in the assembly. "I came hither," said he, "an uninvited guest, because I read sculptured above the door, 'All men born free and equal,' and in this dwelling hope to find myself at home. What is the matter in dispute?" Then they whispered one to another, and murmurs were heard. He is a mere boy. Young people are always foolish and extravagant, or he looks like a fanatic. But others said, he looks like one whom we have been taught to honor. It will be best to tell him the matter in dispute. When he heard it, he smiled and said, it will be needful first to ascertain which of the nuts is soundest within. And with a hammer he broke 1, 2, and more of the English walnuts, and they were moldy. Then he tried the other nuts, but found most of them fresh within and white, for they were fresh from the bosom of the earth, while the others had been kept in a damp cellar. And he said, you had better plant them together, lest none or few of the walnuts be sound. And why are you so reluctant? Has not heaven permitted them both to grow on the same soil? And does that not show what is intended about it? And they said, but they are black and ugly to look upon. He replied, they do not seem so to me. What my Father has fashioned in such guise offends not mine eye. Well, you see where this is going. Jesus himself was dark, you see, and Matthew is bringing this out. And Jesus is, well, see, he goes on. I mean, I could go on with this. I tell you what, I will make sure and link this one down below the video. I strongly suggest you read all of it because it's a strong anti-slavery statement. Matthew, again, was very strong for abolition. And this is his work. And this is signed with a star and the asterisk. This is supposed to be Margaret Fuller. I don't personally know of anything that really fits this style. There's something in Summer of the Lakes where she takes on 2 or 3 characters. I think she was imitating Matthew, signing as an F in the dial when she did that. But it's not really like this. It doesn't have the penetrating insight by any means that this does, or the power. Now, let's go back to 1826 in the Boston Galaxy. Okay, Matthew had not yet quite turned 14, so he's 13 years old here. Okay, this is Mathew Franklin Whittier at 13. I've told you he was a philosopher even from this very young age. Here we have, this is original communications, which means that it was written for the New England Galaxy. Let's see if it has a signature. No, this is anonymous, which shouldn't surprise us particularly. He wouldn't want to put a name to this. He is imitating the language of the Bible, and he's giving history, the history of America, basically, as though it was scripture. Okay, and I'm going to read down until we get to the relevant portion here. And George, remember, this is 1826, so think about what the sensibilities were in the culture in 1826. And George, surnamed the First, King of England, France, Ireland, and many provinces, slept with his fathers, and George II reigned in his stead. And in those days, the pious Puritans of New England, remember Matthew's Quaker, and the Puritans persecuted the Quakers, thought the Lord granted unto them the privilege of making bondmen and bondwomen of those who had the skin of an Ethiopian, and also to take the land of the natives, whose skin was tawny, as a recompense for the labor of keeping them under guardianship. See Matthew's sarcastic irony. And thus with Christian zeal, falsely so called, they drove out the heathen from before their face and planted themselves. Keep in mind, this is radical for today, 2022, okay? The state of Texas is trying to prevent history like this from getting into their classrooms. This is 1826. So when both psychic mediums that I used in 2010 said that Matthew and Abby were ahead of their time, here we have proof. Neither of those psychic mediums had any idea who they were reading, and they both emphasized that Matthew and Abby were ahead of their time. Okay, so here we have objective, flat-out proof. It says, and thus with Christian zeal, falsely so called, they drove out the heathen from before their face and planted themselves, and had black servants, which is, being interpreted, slaves born in their houses. Howbeit the slaves, belonging to the villages of the people of the provinces of the north, were not so evilly entreated as those which fell into the hands of the white people of the provinces of the south, but were permitted to sit down to meal at the foot of the same table with their masters, and to eat and drink as much as their nature required, and to labor as much as their nature could bear. And a certain African, whose name was Cuffy, belonged unto a tiller of the land in a village of the province of Massachusetts. And it came to pass that the barn of the master of Cuffy on a certain hot day in midsummer was burned unto ashes, and the materials round about became a dunghill. But Cuffy was not to be found, although his remains were diligently sought after among the ruins of the barn, if peradventure they might be found. So it was concluded by the wise ones of the land that Cuffy had been guilty of the crime of arson in burning his master's barn, and afterwards had escaped by flight, and so on. So this is almost certainly a real newspaper event that Matthew is recounting as though it was biblical scripture. And the whole thing is a satire on people who think that their worldview is based on scripture, see? So it's scathing commentary by Matthew at age 13, which is way, way ahead of his time. Okay, that's the same voice, and as we found in the New York Tribune, signing with the star. Okay, so now we're going to go to another example, and we're going to look at a sketch. Now, Matthew had a particular style of sketch writing. He was probably the first in America to use this particular style. Back as a boy of 12 and 13, just barely before his 13th birthday, he started this series called Joe Strickland. But a great deal of his work was plagiarized by Francis Durivage and George Burnham around in 1848 and published by them in a number of newspapers and in compilations in the years that followed. Basically, none of that work signed the Olden or the Young'un was actually by those two men. It was all by Mathew Franklin Whittier. But he also wrote in this sketch style under other pseudonyms in material that was not, in fact, plagiarized by Durivage and Burnham. And this is one example. We find it unsigned in the New York Tribune in the July 24, 1845 edition. And it's about a Quaker. Of course, you know, Matthew was raised Quaker. And again, this is unsigned, but it appears in the Tribune in July 24, 1845. This is almost 100% sure Mathew Franklin Whittier by style. And I've gone through, as I've said, over 2,500 of his works. I'm an expert on Mathew Franklin Whittier's style. And as that expert, never mind the reincarnation angle, I'm telling you, this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's work in the New York Tribune, which means that Matthew was in New York City at this time, writing for the same paper, at the very least. Now, it says a true story. I've told you that on these sketches, Matthew almost always drew from real life, just as we saw him saying earlier. So I'll read a little bit of it. Near the close of the last century, a Quaker knight of the shears and thimble. Now, let's stop for a minute, because Matthew loved this colloquialism, a knight of the shears, a knight of the quill as a writer, you know, a knight of the shears as a tailor, and so forth and so on. He loved that phrase. It was one of his favorites, just like the word sublunary, which Edgar Allan Poe cut out of The Raven. See, the knight of the shears and thimble is one of Matthew's favorites. So let's go find out how many times he actually used it. And I'll show you how my database works. So we go to my master file. We go to MFW Research. I know this thing like the back of my hand at this point. If anybody ever gets into this thing, they won't be able to find their way around. We go to MFW. We go to MFW Writing. And I'll just go to Date Modified to make it easy on myself. Here we have an Excel file, MFW Expressions. So we're going to launch that. Of course, it took a lot longer to launch than what I just showed you there. I edited it out. Night of the 25 instances, and I even have it broken down by newspaper. Now, so we're going to go ahead and read a little bit of this true story. Near the close of the last century, a Quaker knight of the shears and thimble, who exercised his avocation in Philadelphia, was imposed upon by an adroit scoundrel who contrived to get a suit of clothes on credit and afterwards sloped without paying for them. The Quaker was too poor to lose the debt, but like too many others of his cloth, see, there's a pun, he had apparently no other alternative, and so on. It's clearly the same style and the same author, except in the end, this Quaker challenged challenged the crook, to come out back and face him, and the guy backed down, see, which is an irony. But see, Matthew was raised Quaker, but he really did not formally align himself with Quakerism, especially as regards nonviolence, necessarily. He was anti-war, but he believed in war for a noble cause, for example, in defense of one's country. He was very much against imperialism, so he wasn't a hardline Quaker, and that's what this little story represents. But see the pun in here? Too many others of his cloth. I am currently going through at least the beginning portion of David Copperfield. And as I read David Copperfield, I don't think Charles Dickens wrote it. I think he had it ghost written for him. He bought somebody else's manuscript, bought the rights to it. He probably didn't steal that one. He probably bought the rights to it. And it's beautifully written. And then I thought, well, there is one phrase in there that was Matthew's, and that's the olden. The olden appears in David Copperfield. And I thought, could Matthew have written this for Dickens? But I don't think so. For one thing, I think it was written from real life. I think David Copperfield is somebody's memoirs that was literal. And secondly, I don't recall, as of like page 34 or 35, wherever I am now, there's no puns in it. If you look at A Christmas Carol and read the opening, that's classic Mathew Franklin Whittier, that opening to A Christmas Carol. Dickens padded it with unnecessary verbiage, but there's a lot of puns in it. That's Mathew Franklin Whittier's puns. Okay, and there's not any hardly in David Copperfield that I recall. It's a wry, clever opening, but I don't recall a lot of puns in it. I have to go back and look and try to count them, But I mean, neither one of those are Dickens, I don't think. Anyway, so here we have in the New York Tribune, unsigned, a story about a tailor, which is a Quaker tailor, which is right down the line like the other Quaker story. So let's go to the New York Constellation. We're talking 1832 here. This is also quite early, January 21, 1832. Matthew was editing this paper at the time. He was the junior editor. This is called A Quaker Jumping a Ditch. Now, is this signed? Let's look. No, this also is unsigned, okay? But it was definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier. This is not Asa Green, the editor-in-chief of the Constellation. Asa Green has been assumed, mistakenly, by scholars to have been a humorist. Well, he didn't write this material. It wasn't his. It was his junior editor, Mathew Franklin Whittier, as a young man. So now Matthew is 19 years old, okay, as of January 21st. A Quaker jumping a ditch. Hezekiah Broadbrim was a fat Quaker in the state of New Jersey who sold molasses, codfish, coffee, china, and earthenware, clothes, and all sorts of liquors. Now, Matthew was pursuing a mercantile career at the same time that he was editing for the Constellation. We like the Quakers very much, who are Quakers indeed, as well as in name. But Hezekiah was a Hickory Quaker. He was somewhat of an old bachelor and had a sister who was somewhat of an old maid, but she was the best creature alive, straight as a candle, blooming as a rose, and smiling as charity. Her name was Dorcas. Now, see, Matthew, he was still officially a Quaker at this time, but he distanced himself from them because of their hypocrisy. Now, this story between Mathew Franklin Whittier and his brother Matthew, in certain respects, it's kind of parallel to what you see from the movie A River Runs Through It, where the older brother kind of stays closer to his father, the preacher, and becomes a professor, whereas the younger brother rebels completely, and the talents that he's been given in writing, he turns to journalism. Well, in a particular sense, that was the case with John Greenleaf Whittier and Mathew Franklin Whittier. But in this case, Matthew was really the deeper philosopher and the more spiritual of a seeker than John Greenleaf was. So Matthew was very concerned with integrity and hypocrisy, and that's what you see here. He says, we like the Quakers very much, who are Quakers indeed as well as name. In other words, who are not hypocritical. And he goes on, Hezekiah and Dorcas walked out one Sunday afternoon in the blooming month of May to breathe the fresh air and view the meadows. The walking was smooth and delightful, with no manner of obstructions, except here and there a ditch full of water spanned by few bridges, and too wide for any man of ordinary jumping capacity to cross at a single bound. But Hezekiah valued himself, as fat people commonly do, on his agility, and instead of walking a few additional rods for the sake of a bridge, must needs leap every ditch he came to. Thee'd better not try that, Hezekiah, said his kind and considerate sister. Never thee mind, Dorcas, returned Hezekiah. There's no danger. I've jumped many a bigger ditch when I wasn't half my present size. All that is very likely, but recollect, Hezekiah, thee's grown exceedingly pursy since thee was a young man. And it goes on. You see that Matthew has the Quaker speech down because, of course, he grew up with it. Well, that's in the Constellation back in 1832. So we see that the Tribune has one, and Matthew had written on almost the same subject many years earlier. All right, so that just gives us an idea that there are pieces that Matthew wrote for the New York Tribune that have no relation to Margaret Fuller's style whatsoever. So let's go on. Let's see here. Matthew was fascinated by science, by technology and new technology. So let's look at this category, science technical, and we have a whole bunch of examples. Obviously, I won't be able to go through all of these, but let's look at what he does in the Tribune first. This is the one that really caught my attention because it contains a smoking gun with regard to the gender of the person writing. He's writing here, this is the Star now, about the Great Britain, which is a British brand new huge steamship, which was docked there at New York City. The writer of this series, the Star Sign series, got permission to tour this ship, and he or she toured the engine room, which is extremely implausible and unlikely for a female reporter. There were basically no female reporters in that day. There was only two kind of women. There was a virtuous woman who kind of kept in her sphere, and there was the fallen woman who was adventurous. See, I mean, I'm talking about the stuffy society at large. It was not proper for a woman to go into the engine room of a ship. And Margaret Fuller was known to be adventurous, okay, and a feminist, but she wouldn't have been allowed in the engine room of a ship. She wouldn't have been invited into the engine room of a ship. And I checked this with an online group of enthusiasts of maritime, 19th century maritime matters. And they all said that if a woman had gone into the engine room of a ship, there would have been catcalls. She would have been seen as a sexual object, and they would have ridiculed her, basically. She would not have been welcome there, okay? So this is almost certainly a man writing this. Now, notwithstanding the long preparation of our minds, we were struck with admiration and delight by a view of the vast steamship. Once again, we envied him of whose thought this is the full-grown offspring, and when admitted to see the apparatus of heart and lungs, that's the engine room, felt that if man is no longer a giant, he is at least the creator of giants. It is a proud feeling to tread these decks from end to end, ought indeed to be proud for those who steer her mighty path upon the ocean. As we looked on her, we longed for a Homer to describe her with that accuracy and detail and full glory of epithet by which he makes present to us the apparatus of the old heroic time. So the Greek described the Argo, earliest bud of a growth that has now towered so high. But that beautiful boat was more to him than all the wonders of our waters are to us, for he contemplated it with deeper feeling and more intelligent appreciation, and so on. Now, if you think this is Margaret Fuller, in your mind, unconsciously, you can't help but put Margaret Fuller in front of you speaking to you. You automatically associate to everything you think you know about her, that she's a philosopher, that she's a transcendentalist. You are hearing the mythical Margaret Fuller, the transcendentalist, the philosopher, speaking to you. If you know this is actually, first of all, not a woman, and secondly, that this is Mathew Franklin Whittier, who was a child prodigy and a philosopher from age 12, who had studied the ancient Greeks, okay, which I know, suddenly it's a whole different experience. Now you're seeing Mathew Franklin Whittier in front of you, speaking to you, okay? It matters very much who you think is writing to you. So this goes on, and I'll let you read this if you want to. There's that, there's more. So you can read this if you want. There's the star at the end. That's Matthew in the Tribune. It can't be Margaret Fuller, okay? She did not go into the belly of the ship in the engine room. There's not too many examples in the Tribune of the interest in technology. I'll just read this paragraph here. Indeed, though these motions and means have not on first introduction that poetic grace which accompanies those which accommodated themselves more to the general condition of earth and sea, they soon exhibit one of their own. The rude break of the railroad through the country is soon hid by the gentle fingers of nature, and grasses and plants creep up to the very track and hide the scars of the blasted rock. By day, both the sound and sight of the rushing train with its smoke and flash become pleasing. If enjoyed at due distance, they enhance the beauty of the surrounding scene. In a dark night, the approach of the train with its fiery eyes is truly sublime. The thought of man seems piercing the kingdom of nature with the swiftness and force of demonic power. Take notice, reader, that demon does not necessarily mean devil, but only super or praetor human being. It is the approach, towering in might, not to be impeded, of the steamer, most majestic, and contrasts finely with the spirit-like motions of the sail ships, the most beautiful of all the works of man. There is room upon the element for the whale as well as the seagull. And he goes on, but in other words, this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's appreciation of technology. Now, we've got a million examples of Mathew doing this in his other works. I'll just give you a couple. This is a letter from Mathew to his brother. It's signed February 19, 1857, and he talks about narrow gauge versus broad gauge railroads. So I'll just give you some idea of his interest in the railroads and in technology. He says, in fact, during all this terrible winter, these trains have never been 5 minutes behind. The reason for the wonderful difference is this. Nearly all the western roads are constructed on the narrow gauge principle. The locomotives and carriages necessarily lighten and are further from the ground, and are thus easily separated and thrown from the track by the drifts, while the carriages and motive power of the broad gauge are much wider and nearer the ground. Frequently this winter from the office window on the wharf, I have seen a complete illustration of the difference in the gauges. Running the entire length of Commercial Street, this Portland, Maine, are two tracks, one narrow, the other broad, connecting the Grand Trunk station with that of the Boston Road. I have seen an array of Irishmen with shovels and 3 or 4 engines work several hours cleaning the narrow track, while on the broad a couple of gigantic freight engines propelling a snowplow of like dimensions would slice through at the rate of 11 miles an hour, piling up huge snow walls on either side. So that's a personal letter. You can get some idea of that. Now, this is Mathew's sense of humor regarding sailing ships. And I actually had to send this letter to a maritime museum to confirm that this is a parody and not written seriously. But this is Mathew. It's not signed, I believe. Let's check. Oh, no, it's signed Trismegistus. Well, I've told you that Trismegistus was Mathew Franklin Whittier going back to 1828. It was not Benjamin Drew, as the editor of the Carpetbag, Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, said in his memoirs, because, it's clearly Mathew's style. It can't be Drew. I got into Drew's personal papers, and there's no indication, that Drew was the author of Trismegistus, except for 2 poems that he apparently plagiarized in his diary and claimed in his diary. You'd think that would be proof positive, but there's nothing else in there, and Drew himself is kind of a milquetoast sort of mild fellow that couldn't possibly have written this satire. He's got no track record other than these 2 poems that he apparently appropriated for his diary. And the reason people would do that is that they shared, in the 19th century, people shared their diaries with their families. So he wanted to impress his wife, possibly his children, that he was the author of that poem. That's the only claim he has to Trismegistus, whereas Mathew was using Trismegistus in 1828. Okay, so we won't go there. But this is by Mathew Franklin Whittier, signing as Trismegistus, and it's a parody on people who brag about how advanced their boat is, okay, basically. I'll just go into a little bit of this because it goes on and on and on and on. Among the many notices of the new ships on improved sailing principles, which have recently been added to our marine, I have hitherto seen no mention of the clipper boat Yellow Squall Hound. She was built in Hull. Her keel was laid by her accomplished owner, Squire Pollock, on the 18th of March last. It is of the best hornbeam and is beveled off at the stern. I've got to put a close quote in here. Another little error. The length of the keel is 21 feet, 7 1/9 inches, breadth 8 1/5 inches, depth 6 2 1/15 inches. To this is secured a keelson, 2 sister keelsons, and 1 brother and 1 nephew keelson. The fastenings mostly relied on here are the best double 10-penny nails from the celebrated works of the Sprue Iron Company. The forefoot is secured by ankle ties, and it goes on and on and on and on in this same vein, okay? Again, that's a parody, but it shows how fascinated Matthew was by these things, because he couldn't write like that if he hadn't educated himself on it. So you can't make a parody on something you don't know anything about. Well, that's technology. That's as far as we're going to take that. Let's look at slavery, okay? And then we'll look at 1 or 2 other categories and we'll be out, because, I mean, I can't make a 5-hour video. This is where I say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but extraordinary evidence takes time. I have enough evidence here that I could go on all day. I could go on for 5 or 6 hours. Who would watch this? You know, skeptical or otherwise, who would watch a 5 or 6 hour video where I presented every single one of these? See, I could go into every one of these and I could read every one of them in its entirety. And you'd have enough evidence basically to convince any rational person that the voice in the Tribune plausibly could be Mathew Franklin Whittier, okay, which is all I'm doing here. But who would watch it, see? So let's look at the Tribune. So this is Frederick Douglass in the Tribune. This is the June 10, 1845 edition, signed with a star. You will see down here, there's the star, and we'll open it up. Frederick Douglass has been for some time a prominent member of the Abolition Party. He is said to be an excellent speaker, can speak from a thorough personal experience, and has upon the audience, besides, the influence of a strong character and uncommon talents. In the book before us, which is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself, in the book before us, he has put into the story of his life the thoughts, the feelings, and the adventures that have been so affecting through the living voice, nor are they less so from the printed page. He has had the courage to name the persons, times, and places, thus exposing himself in obvious danger and setting the seal on his deep convictions as to the religious need of speaking the whole truth. Considered merely as a narrative, we have never read one more simple, true, coherent, and warm with genuine feeling. It is an excellent piece of writing, and on that score to be prized as a specimen of the powers of the black race, which prejudice persists in disputing. We prize highly all evidence of this kind, and it is becoming more abundant. And it goes on. You may read this. There's that part, and that part, and there's the end of it. So you may stop the video and watch that if you want, but that's not Margaret Fuller. Don't associate to her because it's not her. Associate to Mathew Franklin Whittier, whose brother is a famous abolitionist as well, and who is deeply connected with the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad, which is why when he published The Raven, he could not come out, okay, and defend his authorship of The Raven, which this is only like 5 months later. Okay, that's in the Tribune. Let's look at one more in the Tribune. This is a report of a Lyceum series in New Bedford, Mass., and it'll make sense. I'll just read it. It's quick. Our readers may have noticed the act of exclusion by which the citizens of New Bedford have shown the illiberal prejudice against people of color with an unblushing openness unusual even where it exists in its most unchristian form. The black population were denied, even in the case of the most respectable persons, the privilege of membership, and only allowed to hear lectures if they would confine themselves to a particular part of the house. A minority protested in the strongest terms, but the majority persisted in the act of proscription. This is in New Bedford, Massachusetts. We rejoice to hear that, in consequence of these measures, R.W. Emerson and Charles Sumner, who were engaged as lecturers, have declined addressing an audience whose test of merit or right to the privileges of a citizen consists not in intelligence or good character, but the color of the skin. Don't associate to Margaret Fuller and say, oh, now we know that Margaret Fuller was liberal on the slavery issue and the prejudice issue. It was not Margaret Fuller. You're going to have to look elsewhere if you want to make that assertion. Now, that's the Tribune, the Star. Let's look at what else Matthew was doing. Now, most of these are signed with a star. We're going to look at the one that is not signed with a star. This is manifestly a part of Mathew Franklin Whittier's Ethan Spike series, because he talks about Hornby. Well, Hornby was the little town that Matthew's known character, Ethan Spike, supposedly came from. So this is another character from Hornby, but it is not Ethan Spike. This is Bellicose Smith. Well, say that fast, Bellicose Smith, and you'll see that it means bellicose myth. Okay, so that's a play on words. But this is a scathing protest of the Mexican-American War, which Matthew saw as being pure imperialism. And I do mean scathing. I don't know all the references in here, but basically I'll read the introductory paragraph and then you can read the rest of it. Maybe you, if you're a scholar, you will know more of the references than I've been able to figure out, because I don't have that kind of past life memory. That kind of memory belongs to Mathew Franklin Whittier's upbringing, his physical personality, and his brain. I would have to be in deep hypnosis to start actually being Matthew under hypnosis before I would remember these kind of references. So it's not fair of anybody to expect me to have that kind of past life memory. I am Mathew Franklin Whittier. I proved it, but I'm Mathew Franklin Whittier with profound amnesia, basically. Okay, he says, Mr. Wright, that's Elijah Wright, his personal friend and the editor of the Boston Chronotype. When the news reached this place about the Boston fireworks, and we saw that only one piece commemorated the glorious achievements of our army in Mexico, the satire now, all Hornby riz up with indignation. A sum of money was immediately raised in order that a proper testimonial might be given of our devotion to American arms, and I submit the program of our display of fireworks, which will come off on Sunday evening, the evening of the day on which most of our glorious battles were fought. Hornby sets her face against all shams. Hornby never strains at a gate, having previously swallowed the entire sawmill. If battles are fought on Sunday, what's the harm of letting off a few fireworks on the same evening? Well, here's his program, and again, it is absolutely scathing. This is one of his best pieces. I have this physically. So I'll just read some of them I don't know. American Glory, supported by magnificent columns of skulls and crossbones. You understand who you're dealing with here. This is a satirist, okay, a political satirist. An illuminated transparency representing General Taylor, quote, giving the Mexicans hell. That's based on a quote. A correct representation in gold and silver lace work of General Scott holding an italicized Roman candle as he appeared at Veracruz. Flights of pigeons and serpents. Representation of General Cushing, which is Cushing, attacking a regiment of Mexican ladies. And that is a reference to Cushing being a ladies' man. And it's a story that goes. Look at what else follows. At the opening of the piece, a regiment of ladies to the number of several hundred is discovered on the extreme right. General Cushing appears at the left, a little lame from his recent fall. He had gentlemanly stepped off the sidewalk to allow a Mexican woman to pass, and he strained his ankle. Of course, he's killing them on the battlefield, see? So this is Matthew's scathing satire. The general advances briskly to the charge, stopping occasionally to allow the artillery of his eyes to have its full effect. When opposite the center, the general executes the difficult maneuvers of fandango and chase, brandishing the ring bestowed by the Massachusetts ladies. Well, Matthew had elsewhere ridiculed the send-off that he got from the Massachusetts ladies, and discharging several volleys of smiles in quick succession, and he goes on. Then number 9 is representation of the bursting of a shell in the interior of a Mexican dwelling. 10 is flight of serpents. 11 is flights of sub-treasury rockets with showers of gold rain. Well, you can see what he's getting at there. 12. Procession of the skeletons of those who have fallen in the Mexican War, bearing banners with the inscription, "This is glory." Well, this is Mathew Franklin Whittier, the journalist who was raised Quaker, anti-war. You understand who you're dealing with here. So there we have Bellicose Smith. Now, let's look at, this is a review of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Dread, which came out after Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this is a long review. I strongly suggest you read it. I'll just scroll down so that you can read all of it. I suggest you stop the video and read the whole thing. There it is, signed with a star, same signature, except that this is 1856. Margaret Fuller died tragically in 1850. This was published under the same pseudonym that Matthew had used since 1829, 6 years after Fuller's death. And I'll just read a little tiny bit of it. This book fully sustains the author's claim to a prominent position among the first writers of the age. The story is skillfully told, and though it lacks somewhat of the closeness and unity of Uncle Tom, will not be found less interesting. See, Matthew as a critic is strictly honest. The personal dramatists are not properties, myths, or even dead abstract characters, but real living men and women of the present day with whom we become gradually acquainted as by daily intercourse, and with some of whom we are drawn into deep and natural sympathy. Of course, intercourse has a general meaning in the 19th century. The imaginary becomes to every reader real, thus showing the book to be the product not of respectable mediocrity or even of what we call talent, but of genius, true and genuine. It is not, however, as a work of art simply that this book will excite most attention and interest. And then he goes on about the slavery issue. Most of this review is Mathew Franklin Whittier's own insights about slavery. And it's very, very interesting, in my opinion. Basically, what I get from this is that, in his opinion, the slavery system was a transplanting of the feudal system from Europe. This is basically those portion of the people in Europe who wanted to replicate the feudal system. They went to the South. And instead of serfs, they got slaves from Africa. But basically, that's what it was. It's a fallen aristocracy. You know, the aristocracy in Europe was already fallen. And then the South brought it to a level of real degeneracy. That's his view of it. So the condition of the slave states may be summed up thus. They are in government, nominally republics, but really aristocracies, wherein dwell only the name and shadow of liberty. In education they are deficient, in morals corrupt, in religion unsound and fast deteriorating. Nor can it be denied that, to some extent, they have dragged the whole country with them. It can but be that slavery has blunted our moral perceptions and deadened our moral sensibilities, and that as it has introduced many false and pernicious notions, we have conceded to the demands of the black power things which we never had any right to concede, talking about the North, and made submissions which are disgraceful to the last degree. Slavery rules everything here, Mr. Sumner, said honest John Davis, and he might have said with equal truth everything throughout the country. So you can read the rest of this. This is Mathew Franklin Whittier. It was Mathew Franklin Whittier in the Tribune, and that's him signing with the same star in the transcript. There's another one here. Nathaniel Hawthorne apparently wrote a biography of Franklin Pierce, who was conservative and not one of Mathew Franklin Whittier's favorite people, but he did like Hawthorne. At least he liked Hawthorne until Hawthorne wrote that. So he has to comment on this, and I think it's rather painful for him to do so because, again, he liked Hawthorne. He had been personal friends with Hawthorne, if you go by Matthew being the author of this series. So he says, our whole country is pervaded by a vast, mighty, and mysterious power or influence. The way in which we act with reference to it reminds one of the devil worship of Africa. All hate, fear, and detest it, and yet are emulous in their efforts to please and propitiate. To this great shadowy demon, many of our best literary men have made submissions and offerings which, to say the least, are not pleasant to look upon. Every American regards with high respect the editor of the New York Evening Post, but we remember with sorrow certain hunkerish backslidings which occurred between 48 and 54. The sweet professor, too, would stand quite as well in the eyes of Christendom. His fame would be full as clear, did he not so often carry with him that slight stoop of the shoulders which some understand to be an habitual obeisance to the slave demon. And Hawthorne, he too, would have been counted quite as good a writer and quite as reliable a man had he never immortalized his own name and that of the great Mexican hero together. But the victor of Buena Vista and the conqueror of Mexico each had his biographers, and it would have been a great scandal to American letters and American patriotism if the hero of the Mexican War had wanted a man to illustrate and perpetuate his exploits. So Hawthorne cannot be blamed, especially as he got a lucrative office for his book. Only we think he did not choose the most proper way wherein to set forth the glorious deeds of his hero. It should not have been a biography, quote, with extracts from his camp journal, but a poem, an epic poem with battles, wounds, and chivalrous exploits without end. A free use of the poetic license would have made it charming. Hawthorne gives us to understand in his Blithedale that he was once addicted to making verses, and if he had only tried his hand at a Perseid, there is no knowing what poem might have resulted, but we may be too fast. Virgil wrote an eclogue upon the consulship of Pollio, we believe, and we venture to suggest whether Mr. Hawthorne might not yet write a beautiful poem in all heroics upon the administration of his illustrious friend. So, but this is the same star as appeared in the Portland transcript. So again, this is not proof per se, but we're way, way closer than chance. I mean, we've got it to the point of clear plausibility and somewhat beyond plausibility, I would say. Shall we do one more category? This spiritualism in the occult is a whole different topic, which I've dealt with elsewhere. There's a major smoking gun in here because Matthew, as the star in the Tribune, I'll get into it a little bit, has reviewed a book called The Seeress of Provost. And it's a translation by Catherine Crowe in England, who is an occultist. And Matthew reviews this book. I can prove that Matthew was a spiritualist who, in 1855, was scientifically investigating physical mediumship. So 10 years later, Matthew would be on record as an investigator in his own right. This review, signed with a star in the Tribune, is clearly a believer. Okay, this is not somebody who's open-minded. This is not somebody who pretends to be open-minded for political correctness. You know, this is somebody who is convinced by the evidence and who presents the translation of someone else who is convinced of the evidence. Okay, and I mean, I don't need to read it. You can read it for yourself. It's clearly a believer. It's clearly a believer based on study. He's convinced of the truth of these things. And in this review, he talks about levitation. So of the seeress, Kerner mentions one fact of the same character with that now exhibited by the ecstatica and demonica of the Catholic Church. When she was placed in a bath in this state, extraordinary phenomena were exhibited, namely that her limbs, breast, and the lower part of her person, possessed by a strange elasticity, involuntarily emerged from the water. Her attendants used every effort to submerge the body, but she could not be kept down, and had she at these times been thrown into a river, she would no more have sunk than a cork. So Matthew is presenting evidence for levitation. Okay? Now let's go to September 22, 1855. This is unsigned, but we have Matthew's signature. You will see right here Mathew Franklin Whittier's signature. He's one of the men who testifies publicly to having seen certain phenomena. And I've read this a million times. I won't read it again. You're welcome to read it. That a bass drum, snare drum, melodeon, tambourine, triangle, double bass viol, accordion, and guitar were played upon loudly and distinctly while the hands of the medium were held by one of the committee, and so on. So Matthew possibly could have been tricked, but the point is that he was rigorously investigating physical mediumship, occult phenomena. In 1855, which is almost 30 years before the Society for Psychical Research was founded, and this is the same author who was just writing about the seerist of Provost 10 years earlier. There's also an article in the Tribune about Swedenborgianism. Matthew had been a follower of Swedenborg a few years earlier, and I think he'd kind of distanced himself from the church because the church was getting kind of dogmatic, but he still had a great deal of praise for Swedenborg himself. But see, if you get into Somewhere on the Lakes, you will find that Margaret Fuller goes into some depth about this same book, The Seerist of Provost, and her take on it is totally different than what we see in the Tribune. And this is only like a year or two earlier. See, so Margaret Fuller was a skeptic, but she had to make a show of open-mindedness because she was part of the transcendentalist circle. So she kind of fudges it. You know, it's not real clear. She makes herself into three different people, one of whom is an advocate, and then she's the skeptic kind of. And she, if you read between the lines of all of her verbiage, what it boils down to is that there's a place in life for the fanciful and for dreaming. You know, it's not practical, but, you know, heaven forbid that we should not have dreamers in the world, you know, because there's a place for them. There's a place for dreaming. So in other words, she's a skeptic, but she says if people want to imagine things, that's fine with me. That is not, this is a real smoking gun now. That is not the person in the Tribune who wrote on July 23, 1845, as someone who was firmly convinced and is basically evangelical and wants to convince you and provides evidence and evidence of levitation. Okay? It's a total mismatch. It can't possibly be Margaret Fuller writing this series, this star sign series. She was not permitted into the engine room of the Great Britain. She did not want to convince you, you know, of real evidence for levitation. It's just not Margaret Fuller. Here's another topic we definitely have to touch on. Of course, Margaret Fuller is primarily known, other than being a transcendentalist, as a feminist. Matthew he could be called a feminist. It wasn't quite the same as what you would get from Margaret Fuller. She was kind of militant and, you know, pro-women as opposed to men and that kind of thing. Matthew would take the part of women as he would of any minority, you know, in terms of fairness and so on. And he had the example of being married to Abby for 5 years and knowing her for many more years before that. She apparently was his tutor from a pretty young age. He couldn't go to college, but she supplied her privately tutored European type education to him in lieu of his being able to go to college. And she was brilliant. She was utterly brilliant. She was a literary prodigy and a musical prodigy, both. So he really had lived with this mind that was even superior to his, and he was no slouch intellectually, but philosophically and intellectually, she was really above him, and he respected her very deeply, and he never tried to squelch her abilities. But at the same time, I mean, she lived in the 1830s, you know, basically, and she didn't try to become equal to men in the sense of being a man. You know, she was feminine, but she was brilliant intellectually and independent, very independent thinker. She was actually pro-abolition before Matthew was. I think she brought him around to that. She also brought him around to the metaphysical and the paranormal eventually. But so he had this example of a woman who was very much a woman and yet was very accomplished intellectually and a free thinker. So that was his feminism. So in the Tribune, you find not Margaret Fuller, but Mathew Franklin Whittier, the person who is liberal about women as well as he is about many other groups. It's a distinction, and you find that in many examples. Now, there's several articles that have to do with women. Keep in mind that Margaret Fuller could have written one or two of these herself. I personally think that where there was a female writer that Matthew wasn't particularly thrilled with, but Margaret Fuller had to champion every woman, that there was. So Margaret Fuller would get in and either rewrite them, or occasionally she might have written them entirely herself, where Matthew couldn't honestly, bring unqualified praise to that person. But I think that where women are talked to in general, women's rights and so on, that this is actually Matthew. Now let's look at one that I have marked as having masculine phrasing, and I think I may have enlarged the type on this. Yeah. So this is critics and essayists. Now Matthew wrote about the critic in the Dial, the first, after Emerson's introduction, I believe the very first article in the Dial is Mathew Franklin Whittier's F-signed article about critics. See, that's not Margaret Fuller. But anyway, here we demand from the critic that imagination, refined perceptions, and a manly judgment should have been tempered through his studies and examinations to make a weapon of so keen and delicate a power that, like the Damascus blade, it will cast but a single and sufficient gleam of light, whether in severing the mail breastplate or the silken curtain. This we find not in Mr. Horn, who he's reviewing. That's not a woman talking. I know that Fuller in the mid-19th century would kind of speak of, he and him and men and so on. This is not the, 21st century. But nonetheless, there was no reason why she had to speak of the critic exercising a manly judgment, see, with a sword analogy. It's not a female writing this piece. So now let's go to some of these pieces that are specifically about women. This is the September 30, 1845 edition of the New York Tribune, signed with a star, The Wrongs of American Women, the Duty of American Women. So he says, the same day brought us a copy of Mr. Burdett's little book, in which the sufferings and difficulties that beset the large class of women who must earn their subsistence in a city like New York are delineated with so much simplicity, feeling, and exact adherence to the facts, and a printed circular containing proposals for immediate practical adoption of the plan more fully described in a book published some weeks since under the title, The Duty of American Women to Their Country, which was ascribed alternately to Mrs. Stone and Miss Catherine Beecher, but of which we understand both those ladies declined the responsibility. The two matters seemed linked with one another by natural piety. Full acquaintance with the wrong must call forth all manner of inventions for its redress, and he goes on about that. Much has been written about women's keeping within her sphere, which is defined as the domestic sphere. As a little girl, she is to learn the lighter family duties while she acquires that limited acquaintance with the realm of literature and science that will enable her to superintend the instruction of children in their earliest years. It is not generally proposed that she should be sufficiently instructed and developed to understand the pursuits or aims of her future husband. She is not to be a helpmeet to him in the way of companionship or counsel, except in the care of his house and children. Her youth is to be passed partly in learning to keep house and the use of the needle, partly in the social circle where her manners may be formed, ornamental accomplishments perfected and displayed, and the husband found who shall give her the domestic sphere for which exclusively she is to be prepared. Now, and then he goes on to say not all women can do that. Some don't marry and some are widows and so on, that it's not practical to expect that. And what about these women who are left out, But this is why I say that Abby Poyen, his future wife, had a complete European education, because in Europe, they weren't educated like that. They got a full education like women do today. It was in America that they were educated the way that he's describing here. So again, if you automatically assume this is Margaret Fuller, the feminist, you'll imagine Margaret Fuller talking to you, and that's how you'll experience it. But it isn't. This is a feminist man. This is not a female. And he goes on with that point that not all women are in that position. So I won't keep going into that. You can read it yourself. Again, hopefully you'll be able to see this on the screen because the resolution degrades a little bit on YouTube. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to see these. He says, "Blessed be the generous, the wise among them who seek to forward hopes like these instead of struggling against the fiat of providence and the march of fate to bind down rushing life to the standard of the past. Such efforts are vain, but those who make them are unhappy and unwise." That, just in terms of writing style, that is Mathew Franklin Whittier's writing style. You've seen it before in here. And I wish I could read this whole thing. We don't really have time for that. There's another one, Glumdalclitches, and that's also Mathew Franklin Whittier. See, that's not Margaret Fuller. Let's go into some other things. This is 1831. This is September of 1831. So Matthew's 19 years old. He's writing as the star. Okay, here he is. There's our star down there. He's writing for the Philadelphia album, although he's living in New York City and I think he's commuting back and forth between New York City, where he was editing the New York Constellation, and Philadelphia, because this was part of his mercantile career that I told you about. He was working for a trading company, and apparently he traveled back and forth. This is about female education. This is the same topic, except this is August 27, 1831. Okay, so he begins, "Female education. Could we grave it with a point of steel in deep wounds upon every neglecting parent's heart? Could we write it upon the walls of every parlor in letters of living fire? Could we teach the playful lightning to case in form of letters along the black thundercloud? We would have it written in terms so palpable that none could shut it from their view. Educate your daughters." You understand, this is the same writer, back in 1831. He hasn't changed. This is the thing about Matthew. As soon as he gets on the stage at age 12, he sounds just like he does as an adult. That's because he was a child prodigy. That's what a child prodigy means, that he had written like this in past lives. So he jumps in with the talent. "At the present period of advancement and refinement, there is no subject calculated more strongly to elicit the regret of the philanthropist than the neglect which is displayed in the tuition of the female sex, and when we consider the important station which woman occupies in her career of life, how shall we account for this wanton carelessness?" Now, in 1831, Matthew is still making the point that we need to educate women so they can educate their sons, who can grow up to be educated men. So he has moved a little bit on his position, I would say, but not that much. I mean, basically, this is still Matthew, still signing as a star, still advocating for female education. So let's move a little bit. I want to go to something from 1874. Now, Matthew's feeling about all of this, as near as I can tell, is that he still put Abby up as his ideal, which is to say, a woman who is feminine, who tries to express the best of being feminine, but who is not squelched in her individuality or her intellectual freedom. See, he wants her to be the best she can be as a human being while still being feminine. I mean, as an ideal. Whereas what he found was that the feminist movement back then got gradually taken over by women who were increasingly militant and who wanted not only all the rights of men, but who basically wanted to be men. Okay. And of course, some women, maybe they've reincarnated recently as a man. Maybe it's their choice. They want to be more masculine in their personality, and that's up to them. But in terms of the society as a whole, he felt that women were trying too hard to be men and becoming militant in an aggressive way that really was not flattering to their sex, not that they should be kept in their sphere in the old sense, that they should be sitting there in their sewing circle and in the home and raising children and not have any idea of what their husband did for a living or anything like that. So he didn't mean it that way. He meant that they would be women, see? So in 1874, as Ethan Spike, now Ethan Spike is his caricature, right? But he sometimes identifies with him. So it's very difficult to tell exactly what's Matthew writing autobiographically and what's his shadow side, so to speak. What is his opposite, Ethan Spike? So Ethan Spike goes to anniversaries. Well, apparently there were all kinds of meetings around this time. And one of them was the feminists, right? So Ethan Spike he ends up attending this feminist meeting. He's probably the only man in the building. And they shoot him down. Let's see. He says, I give it as my ID that women had a spear, meaning a sphere, which they'd oughter keep into. And when she climbs or breaks through the fence, providentially built round the spear, should be treated like any other breechy critter. So here's the response to that. Why, will the gent tell us what he means by his spears? Blandly inquired a sharp-nosed and chinned lady, with her dress hung straight from shoulder to heel. What is spears, says I. I, says she. Spears, says I, is, I think, that is, I calculate e'en just about everybody knows what constitutes spears, and it is very evident, interrupts she, that the gent is not one of the e'en just everybodies he mentions, and that it is exceeding doubtful if he knows anything. I respectfully propose that he proceed to dry up. And I proceeded, glad to get off so easily, as this eminent pillar and champion of the downtrodden sects really looked vicious and capable of doing me bodily harm. So my feeble remarks was unspoken and will so continue forever, for I was so unjointed by the assault that I have never been able to recall even the heads of that remarkable effort. I may venture to observe, however, that I think they was suthin in the nature of a crusher. Of course, the strong-minded one improved the occasion. She said women had no spear, wanted none, and would not be shut up into one at no price. Remarked that the whole boundless continent was hern, and would like to see the audacious man, here she looked wicked at me, which would try to put a narrower Utica onto her. She also called me a masculine gander. I tried to leave, but she fixed me like an ancient mariner with her glittering eye. She had but only one, and I sought like a chipmunk afore the jaws of a streaked snake, while she slung Joan d'Acre, Queen Elizabeth, Abigail Folsom, and a complete assortment of distinguished females at my unprotected head. Hoping to mollify my enemy during a temporary lull in her eloquence, I deferentially remarked that, though personally unacquainted, I had the highest possible respect for all these ladies, and begged through her to convey to each my distinguished regards, to which the strong one answered, "Scat, get out." Anyway, you can read the rest. It's a scream, I think. But this is Matthew kind of lampooning the extreme militant feminist perspective as his ignoramus Ethan Spike, see? So you can see Matthew's ambivalence about this. Again, in the Tribune, where people think this is Margaret Fuller, the feminist, if they'd look closely, they'd see a man who has a little bit of ambivalence about it. There's one more subject that we have to touch on, and I'm sorry if my voice sounds a little bit different because I'm kind of adding this at the end, and that is philanthropy and social causes and things of that nature, because Margaret Fuller is known for this, but a lot of what she's known for was actually Mathew Franklin Whittier's passion about these subjects. So let's go into the Tribune and we'll look at just one example or a couple examples of what was being done in the Tribune. This is the first one we're going to look at. This is in the March 19, 1845 edition. It's called Our City Charities. This was a visit to Bellevue Almshouse, to the farm school, the asylum for the insane, and the penitentiary of Blackwell's Island. Now, these are tricky. If you get into these originals, what you find is that Margaret Fuller may have accompanied Matthew on one or two of these trips, and she disagreed with him. For example, in one of these, he apparently gave the opinion at the insane asylum that you shouldn't be too judgmental about them because just about anybody under the most severe circumstances could at least temporarily become insane. And this came from his own experience because when he'd lost Abby a mere 4 years earlier, he had gone through a period of mental instability, which is, of course, what you see in the poem The Raven. But Margaret Fuller, who I think was really neurotic, went into denial about this and got quite huffy about it, and it's like, speak for yourself, buddy, because I could never, have any problems. So you'll see that she abused her power as the literary editor and would occasionally rework his writing and stick in her own paragraphs under the same signature. And so you have to be aware that she was so brazen as to do that. But in general, we have Matthew's visit to these institutions, and there's many examples of him doing this before and afterwards. So this is typical for him. I know there's some indication that Margaret Fuller would do this, but I don't think it was really her. I think she did it because it was expected of her. Just like Ashen Dodge claimed to have been the writer of Quails in the Boston Weekly Museum and would talk about how he went to the World Peace Congress. Well, Ashen Dodge was a conservative, or a closet conservative, and a con artist. He would have had no interest in the World Peace Congress. And I think it's the same thing basically with Margaret Fuller. But with that caveat, let's read a little bit of this. The aspect of nature was sad. What is worse, it was dull and dubious when we set forth on these visits. Now, we could be the royal we, or it could be him and Margaret Fuller. The sky was leaden and lowering, the air unkind and piercing. The little birds sat mute and astonished at the departure of the beautiful days which had lured them to premature song. It was a suitable day for such visits. This is a typical lyrical opening by Mathew Franklin Whittier referencing nature. I could show you 100 examples of this. The pauper establishments that belong to a great city take the place of the skeleton at the banquets of old. Now here's Matthew the philosopher coming in. They admonish, he's a Stoic philosopher. They admonish us of stern realities which must bear the same explanation as the frequent blight of nature's bloom, and so on. Again, that's Matthew the Stoic philosopher coming in. At the almshouse there is every appearance of kindness in the guardians of the poor, and there was a greater degree of cleanliness and comfort than we had expected. But the want of suitable and sufficient employment is a great evil, and so on, that they need something to keep them busy. Well, you can go back and find the original of this, and you can read it. We were sorry to see mothers with their newborn infants exposed to the careless scrutiny of male visitors, in other words, when they were nursing, and so on. In the yard of the hospital, we saw a little Dutch girl, a dwarf, who would have suggested 1,000 poetical images and fictions to the mind of Victor Hugo or Sir Walter Scott. She had been brought here to New York, as we understood, by some showman and then deserted. I don't know if that was Barnum. So that this place was her only refuge. No one could communicate with her or know her feelings, but she showed what they were by running to the gate whenever it was opened, though treated with familiar kindness and seeming pleased by it. She had a large head, ragged dark hair, a glowering wizard eye, an uncouth yet pleasant smile like an old child. She wore a gold ring, and her complexion was as yellow as gold, if not as bright. Altogether, she looked like a gnome more than any attempt we have ever known to embody in art, that fabled inhabitant of the mines and secret caves of earth. Then he goes on to the farm school and so on. This is typical Mathew Franklin Whittier, which I will show you. All right, so that's the Tribune. So now let's go by date and look at some of the other things that Matthew did along the same line. Now we're going to go to the January 7, 1832 New York Constellation, which Mathew Franklin Whittier was editing under Asa Green, the editor-in-chief. He talks about the debtor's prison, and he cites a cartoon here at the beginning, which I have found. And then he says, this is indeed a severe and touching commentary on the crime of poverty. Crime it may well be called when it is visited with such awful consequences. Here, and it is not a picture of the imagination merely, we behold a man, a fellow being like ourselves, shut out from all the sympathies of society, separated from his wife and children, driven from his trade or daily labor, upon the fruits of which they depend for a livelihood, and locked up in a dungeon without the barest possibility of supporting himself or his famished family. But the gnawings of hunger are as but nothing to the pangs of his agonized soul. We will suppose him to be honest, that he contracted the debt for which he is confined with the full determination of paying it, but was prevented from doing so by sickness, by want of employment, or by some other unforeseen casualty. That's Mathew Franklin Whittier. And it's signed D. That was his typical go-to signature in the constellation, so we know it's Mathew. I can prove that. Now, we have been thus minute in our examinations, not to excite the disgust or to shock the sensibilities of our readers, but that we might exhibit to them some of the unhappy effects of the law of imprisonment for debt. For ourselves, we have frequently witnessed the scene described, and have listened to the heart-rending tale of some imprisoned debtor. We lately received a note from an inmate of our jail in whom we had become interested, and whose release we were endeavoring to effect, which we give entire, only suppressing names. So here we have proof that in 1832, probably in 1831, Mathew Franklin Whittier in New York City was visiting these places and fighting debtor's prison. He later wrote a book called The Debtor's Prison, A Tale of a Revolutionary Soldier, and published it, I believe, in 1834, anonymously. Scholars mistakenly attribute that to his editor-in-chief, Asa Green. It was not by Asa Green. It was by Mathew Franklin Whittier. And this is before Charles Dickens was publishing anything of the sort, you will note. But anyway, that's very early. Now we're going to move to after Mathew worked for the New York Tribune. We'll just kind of go through these in date order as much as I can. This is for the Boston Chronotype. We've seen the Boston Chronotype before. Elijah Wright is the editor, and he writes about Channing. And let's see what he says. Oh, he is defending Channing against some idiot who basically said that Channing should stick to writing and not have any interest in philanthropy. So that's just Mathew, but notice the signature. It's a star. It's the same signature now in the chronotype. So Mathew blasts this guy, saying we should like to have this sagacious twaddler tell us what greater wrong there is in the world than the combination of evils which he has mentioned above. He thinks, does he, that there is great danger that rigid devotion to philanthropic causes will lead to a neglect of other duties. Judging from the puerile effusions which infest the columns of the Atlas, and make it deserve the title of weekly rather than daily, as Mathew's puns again, we should say there does not seem to be any cause of alarm in his own case. So he says, as an intellectual man and as a writer, Channing stands in the front rank of the world's scholars, but his mere literary fame fades by the side of his self-denying labors as a Christian philanthropist. Here again, Mathew Franklin Whittier is projecting his own ideals onto people that he's praising. See, already you should be getting a sense of Mathew Franklin Whittier as a writer and as a philosopher. I have a much, much greater sense of that because I have read and studied over 2,500 of his works. Now, let's go on in date order. This is a series called Gossip from Gotham, which is to say New York City. I am convinced that this is Mathew Franklin Whittier. There was a long series of letters to the chronotype from Mathew signed XFW. Again, a very thinly veiled pseudonym. But he stopped them at the point where he started reporting on these sensitive issues. He stopped signing them. So this is not signed. It's a series, a column called Gossip from Gotham. XFW is gone for some time now. So I'm saying this is Mathew. And he says, last evening, Monday, the New York Society for the Abolition of Capital Punishment held its annual meeting in the Minerva Rooms. The large hall was filled to a perfect jam. Of course, he was there. Many were obliged to go away without obtaining admission. Extra seats were constantly brought in till there was no room for more, and every square foot of the hall was occupied. Now he talks about the people who spoke there. Wendell Phillips, of course, was also an abolitionist. He was personal friends with the Whittier family. Horace Greeley, that was or had been his editor on the Tribune. He was succeeded by William Elder of Philadelphia, and then Frederick Douglass, and so on. So that was Mathew Franklin Whittier reporting on the anti-capital punishment. But that's also in the Tribune. There's an attack on capital punishment, and particularly a scathing review of the writers who had been proponents of capital punishment in the Tribune. I don't seem to have that in here. It should be in here, but it's not necessary to go into that. In the Portland transcript, we have a visit to a jail and a visit to an almshouse. This is a series I recently discovered. It's called Local Sketches in the 1850 Portland transcript, and this is his visit to the jail. The jail, and why not the jail? Doubtless many of our readers, like ourselves, have walked our streets for many years, have jostled in the crowd the thief and the midnight burglar, have heard of their deeds, nay, have felt them, have seen them in the prisoner's dock, and heard them sentenced to many years' confinement, and yet have known the jail only by report, and so on. So such were our thoughts when not long since we found ourselves entering the little passage which leads to the jail, and he talks about it, and it sounds exactly like the star-signing writer in the Tribune. And I do mean exactly, because it's the same person. But we will leave this cell and enter the opposite one, which is occupied. The door is thrown open, and we catch a glance of a young man industriously walking from one side to the other of his narrow bounds. Entering, we are oppressed by a sense of confinement. The closely overhanging walls seem to press down upon and crush us, and an almost overpowering sense of the weariness of confinement here makes us readily appreciate the motives of the cell walker. He is a foreigner and is here awaiting his trial for burglary, but a sadder sight to see are the two boys confined with him. Not apparently more than 12 or 14 years of age, there is a look of stolid hardihood in their countenances painful to behold. They are within the fatal current, and we much fear this will not be their last acquaintance with prisons. Upon the walls are scratched the initials of former occupants now gone to the state prison or to their last trial, and so forth. So that's one. There's another one in this same series, A Visit to the Almshouse. Local Sketches, number 8, The Almshouse. He begins with a poem by Crabbe. Matthew typically would bring in poetry in his works. The buildings appropriated to the, quote, parish poor, even in England, have been much improved since the time of Crabbe, but although, quote, walls of mud and, quote, broken doors no longer characterize them, their inmates remain the same. The waifs and the strays of society, the ignorant, the imbruted and the vicious, the imprudent, the lazy and the proud, the unfortunate and the erring and the oppressed, all are represented here. If any man would learn the uncertainty of riches and the fickleness of friendship, the inevitable misery which results from idle and vicious habits, if he would see the fall of pride and the vanity of fame, the wretchedness which follows the prodigal's course, and the imbruting effects of ignorance and crime, let him visit the parish workhouse and question its inhabitants. He will find there men and women who once moved in the highest circles of society, now, quote, fallen from their high estate and mingling with those who never knew a better fate than that which now attends them. There, too, he will find amid the misery, the broken hopes, lost joys, and sad remembrances, high examples of patience and long suffering under misfortune, and surrounded by the vicious and the hardened, will sometimes find a bright example of virtue and endurance. That's Mathew Franklin Whittier's prose, okay? You can see this is not just any writer, okay? This is an exceptional writer and a philosopher. It was never Margaret Fuller. It was always Mathew Franklin Whittier. So let's look at, maybe one or two more? This is Quails. This is the one that entertainer Ossian Dodge falsely claimed. See, all of Mathew's work, a lot of his best work was claimed by somebody else. I've had to wrest it from the grasp of all of these phonies. So here, this is Mathew, who goes by the byline, our flying correspondent. He's overseas. He's in Glasgow, and July of 1851, and he goes through Ireland, and he is kind of appalled by the poverty that he sees. So Drogheda, I guess that's how it's pronounced, contains about 5,000, or Drogheda, contains about 5,000 inhabitants and was once very noted for its talent, beauty, and commerce. It was formerly a walled town of great strength and magnificence, and was the residence of many of the most influential statesmen in Ireland. But during the bloody and destructive wars with Cromwell, the walls of the town and all the principal churches were torn down, and now the crumbling remains of past magnificence can be seen just peering out from among the running ivy and undressed hedge bushes, which grow uncared for and with great rankness in these moldering heaps. Drogheda is now nothing more than one great poorhouse, where are congregated filth, poverty, and degradation. We saw many children moving about like the specters of Ardvin, which, as the poet expresses it, seem like the darkened moon behind the mist of night. This was typical of Matthew to bring in poetry, as I said. Girls just emerging into womanhood with nothing but remnants of long, worn-out shirts to cover their nakedness. Feeling their degradation, for the Irish before all other nations in the world possess a natural modesty, the poor girls shrunk from our presence as if unable to bear up under the mortification. Blear-eyed old men, withered, shrunken, and decrepit women, children with wan and dirty countenances filled up the passageway and exclaimed in weak and pitiful voices, "May the blessings of the Holy Virgin rest upon you, sir, and will ye plaise give me a halfpenny?" So this is Matthew in dialect, because Matthew was a master of writing in dialect, and this is also his descriptive language, his descriptive power, and his compassion. Then we get into his politics. The Americans are probably aware that wood is an article hard to be obtained in Ireland at any price, and that peat or bog as a fuel is the only thing used, but they will probably be surprised to learn that a few of the rich own all the land and make the poor pay whatever they choose to ask for bog, or live entirely without fuel until want compels them to bend to the stern decree of Irish aristocracy. In the vicinity of Wellington Inn, and indeed for miles on this railroad, bog is found in immense quantities, extending sometimes for miles each way, and varying from 2 to 50 feet in depth. And still, we are informed that landowners required the poor people to pay at the rate of 16 guineas per acre for each layer of bog taken out. And then he talks about the making of bog. So, I mean, there's Matthew, the social activist, you see. It was never Margaret Fuller where you see those things. So her reputation that has been built up as a philosopher and a social activist, to the extent that it's based on this star sign material, is all a mistake. So I think we'll leave it there. I mean, I could go into all of these different categories, see, but that just gives you an idea that all we've established today for sure is that when Mathew Franklin Whittier wrote as the Star and under other pseudonyms from way back 1830 all the way up, way back to 1826, all the way up to the 1860s, or 1870s, that it's the same voice, plausibly, that you see in the Tribune. So the point of all this is, and I'll close with this, when I present talking about Margaret Fuller, and I say that Mathew Franklin Whittier had written, signing with the same signature from 1829 all the way to 1873, I don't just mean that he wrote anything. I mean that he wrote it in this same style.